Yo, how's it going everybody? It's Sketch and welcome back to the channel. And on today's episode we're picking up where we left off on a series we covered last year, being F.E.A.R's third and final entry that was developed by Day One Studios and published by Warner Bros. Interactive for the PC, PS3, and Xbox 360 in June of 2011. This sequel, being the last entry in its series, actually does a few notable things even without majority of its original development studio. F.E.A.R 3 does have some solid contributors that some may not expect while adding in some new gameplay elements. Though before getting much further, let's catch up on the story from the previous installments. Occurring 9 months after the events of both prior F.E.A.R games, we find ourselves in the shoes of the Point Man once again after being captured by Armacam soldiers in Brazil. Paxton Fettel, who's now a specter of sorts, jumps in a nearby guard to bust you out of the interrogation proceedings and sets you free. The duo then forms an alliance while making their escape, and as the story moves forward, you both discover that they, as well as Alma Wade, are being hunted by a monster only known as the Creep, which is an amalgamation of the memories of Harlan Wade. Through a series of 8 stages, you'll both work in tandem or solo to bring down this menace and reunite with Alma. Gameplay wise, we got the familiar FPS F.E.A.R seen in the previous entries, as well as the expansions from F.E.A.R 1, coupled with the more recently seen mechanics of F.E.A.R 2 with being able to aim down sights. A few new features are introduced, mainly being cooperative play between the Point Man and Paxton Fettel, where players can either run as the Point Man for a more central feel to the series, or run Paxton Fettel, who can possess and body snatch enemies to go into combat with him being a ghost and all. Controls here feel more similar to the series' second entry, while replacing the lean mechanics with the peeking function similar to that of the Gears of War series. Depending on the difficulty settings, you may or may not use it as much as developers envision, especially if you're familiar with shooters and or the franchise, though it can save your skin in a pinch if you're taking a lot of damage or potentially getting swarmed. Health is also now on a regeneration system, much like shooters of the period, as opposed to health pack and upgrades seen in its previous entries, making this one slightly easier to not get smoked as quickly. Through the game's 8 intervals, you'll carve through nearly everything with a pulse in often spectacular fashion, with a fair amount of action set pieces. This entry would also mark the involvement of John Carpenter directing the cinematics alongside Steve Niles, who wrote the game's overall scope. This in turn does make for a more action-driven affair than the last few times around Fairport, but it does have its frightening and grotesque moments, even if there aren't quite as many of them as before. Besides the Armacam soldiers, you'll see a few new enemy types this time around, and depending on which one you're mainly dealing with, really leans into the feel of more action or more horror. You've got a wide variety of weapons at your disposal, like the submachine gun, burst rifle, shotgun, sniper rifles, and majority of the weapons from previous games and a couple of new additions do return, like the arc beam for example. You definitely got the arsenal to wreak some havoc through the game, and there's also a mech section similar to F.E.A.R 2, which is also pretty fun. The bullet time feature does return, along with a couple of other gameplay elements like achievements for doing X amount of actions per stage, like kills with certain weapon types, headshots, psychic score if you find bodies along the stage and perform psychic links, and finding the hidden Alma dolls, of which there are several. This mechanic will affect the ending if played in cooperative mode, though for the sake of those who haven't played this before, that will be kind of a major spoiler as to how this affects the ending. Graphics wise, F.E.A.R 3 is running on some slightly different hardware, considering this entry isn't using the Littech engine like the past entries did, since this wasn't solely developed by Monolith. F.E.A.R 3 runs on the Despair engine that Day One Studios also used for their previous title, Fracture. This engine by comparison does have some similar traits like its dynamic lighting effects, though this engine weaves in the Havoc physics, which admittedly does have some slick tricks within it. We also get some spectacular kill animations, much like how the shotgun ripped apart whatever was in front of it in past entries. Now several weapons can reduce your ops to a fine red mist in a matter of moments. A well-placed grenade can also jib several replicas at once, which is also pretty sick to see, especially in slow motion. When enemies aren't exploding, there's still plenty of viscera to go around with each encounter. The boss encounters here are also pretty decent visually, since boss characters are often huge in this entry, especially the final fight with the Creep, which towers stories above you. Most bosses are bigger than your character and also have some nice defeat animations. The Electro replica explodes like a transformer in a rainstorm, and the lighting effects here are pretty sick. Level designs themselves are all over the shop, starting out with the establishing prison level as you're being interrogated. From the confines of this area, each one progressively opens up more from there. The store level is a pretty interesting stage in itself, with its labyrinth of ladders and towers of TV sets. As you go further into the game and the environmental effects start kicking off, it gets pretty raucous visually, with fiery pits that form out of seismic activity and objects that just randomly burst into flames. Particle and lighting effects, much like the last few games, also look good here, and this might be the brightest color palette the series has used yet. The level of detail on environments and textures all look fairly solid, and there's some pretty sick shading techniques seen in the stages and weapons, which is pretty tight. This entry also has several lengthy cutscenes, as mentioned earlier, that were directed by John Carpenter, and there are a lot of these throughout the game. These bits will fill in some of the gaps from the last 2 games while showing you updates as to where some of these characters are currently. The cutscenes and gameplay both utilize the new engine rather well, with sequences that said, are relatively solid across the board with some interesting moments and visuals throughout the campaign. Sound-wise, F.E.A.R 3 is pretty crisp with a fair amount of in-game dialogue and radio chatter as you play the 6 to 8 hour campaign, and the voice acting here is pretty decent. While it's not anything too out of the ordinary for the franchise, it's delivered pretty well all things considered. Sound effects are a little bit all over the place though, with some really good atmospheric effects like the changes in tone as you run across different surfaces and through surroundings, to shell casings falling in the grass or a hallway. Foley art heard here is also pretty good with sounds of shorting circuitry and chatter of your enemies depending on their distance, which is either louder or softer, which is some nice attention to detail in a lot of spots here. On the other hand, there's some sound effects that maybe don't have quite as much behind them like some of the gunfire audio. Gunfire audio here doesn't exactly sound bad, but maybe a bit quieter than what you'd expect, though in slow motion it still sounds pretty awesome. Explosions, however, still sound just as good as past entries. The shotgun also has a nice bit of bass behind it along with the sniper rifle, so for every sound that has kind of a meh effect to it, it's got a couple of others that are pretty good. The soundtrack itself lends well to the more action-driven feel this entry rolls with, while splicing in some more moody and ethereal tunes in the background. For what's there, you'll hear a range of music that when it crescendos with the action, and for the most part has a familiar feel to the past entries. Overall, the audio is pretty decent, even though it's got spots where that with a few more additions and attention to detail would have been tight. Though for what's there, it's above average mainly. As a whole, the F.E.A.R series has a lot of high points, and this is one of those franchises that hooked me almost immediately after playing the first game, which led to eventually playing all of them pretty much as they released. That being said, each game and the original's expansions, while having central aspects tie them all together, each entry is more or less its own thing, doing something a little bit different each time. One of the major changes that happened over time was the more action-focused approach that progressively got more bombastic, but in the end, these are all really fun shooters, just over time a little bit less scary. The heavy J-horror feel from the first game isn't quite as pronounced in the sequels, but it still acknowledged its past while keeping up with times, producing a solid series of games. F.E.A.R 3 gets an 8 out of 10 and comes recommended to FPS fans and fans of the franchise, even considering compared to its previous sequels, it's nowhere near as scary. However, it will throw some frights and horrific twists in the campaign, some more obvious than others, but the core vibe is still there. The co-op feature is one of the main draws with this, and it's a fun way to play it while also being awesome solo since you get a couple of different methods to play, giving most a reason to go for multiple clears. This is also a fun and quick shooter to blast through around this time of year, and going through the whole series is actually a unique experience, truly having significant impact for shooter and horror fans. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for checking out this video. If you find these videos helpful, that's awesome. I'm glad you use it as a resource. Check back often. We'll have more reviews and commentaries coming up in the near future, but until then, take it easy, stay safe out there. I'll see you on the next one.